I never thought I would reach a day where my lips could form these words, let alone share them with the world. For decades I carried a silence that burned like fire inside me, a silence that devoured my joy and made me question every breath I took. I prayed that the memories would fade, that the wounds would heal on their own, that time would be enough to bury the truth. But time is a cruel keeper of secrets. It does not erase them. It only presses them deeper until they surface when you least expect it, reminding you of the pain you tried so hard to forget. I am not here to relive my shame for the sake of pity. I am here because I believe that light can only pierce the darkness if we dare to speak. I know there are souls out there who carry their own hidden crosses, who wake up each morning with a smile for the world but cry themselves to sleep each night. To you, I offer my story, not as a spectacle, but as a testimony that silence does not have to be the end of your life. There is a path, however narrow, toward healing. I was once a mother who believed her home was a sanctuary. I believed that within my own walls I was safe, cherished, and untouchable by cruelty. I believed that love was the foundation of family. What I did not know was that the very child I carried beneath my heart would one day become the one who broke it into pieces. My son, the boy I nursed through fevers, the boy I held close when storms shook the windows, the boy I whispered prayers over as he slept, he became the shadow that haunted every corner of my being. It feels impossible to say it plainly. My son violated me. Not once, not twice, but for years that stretched like an endless desert. Each time I told myself I must endure. Each time, I wondered if God had turned his face away from me. Each time, I chose silence, because fear wrapped around my throat tighter than any rope could. But silence has its breaking point, and mine came the day my husband walked through the door earlier than expected. That moment changed everything. But before I tell you about that day, I need you to understand how the darkness began, because evil rarely bursts in all at once. It slips in quietly, like a draft beneath a locked door. When my son was small, he was tender and affectionate, a child who sought my arms more than any toy. I cherished it, though sometimes I wondered if his attachment was too heavy. My husband was a hard-working man, often gone long hours at the factory. The distance between us as a couple left me pouring more of myself into the children, especially into our eldest. At first, his closeness seemed natural, an extension of childhood. But as the years passed and he grew into adolescence, that closeness shifted. There were glances that lingered too long, questions that felt strange, moments that made me uneasy, though I could not explain why. I brushed them away as foolish imagination. A mother does not suspect her own child. A mother tells herself that every shadow is just her mind playing tricks. And so I silenced those instincts, convinced that love and prayer would keep everything pure. I was wrong. I will never forget the first time the line was crossed. It was not loud or violent, but the weight of it crushed me more than any force could. I remember standing frozen, my breath stolen, my heart pounding in my ears as if the walls themselves were collapsing. I wanted to scream, to run, to strike out, but I did nothing. Fear paralyzed me. The voice inside me whispered, "No one will believe you. He is your son. They will call you mad." That night I locked my bedroom door for the first time in my life. Yet even behind that door, I did not feel safe. I sat in the corner of the room with my knees drawn to my chest, trembling like a child in a storm. I whispered prayers into the darkness, asking God if he had abandoned me. The silence that answered back was heavier than stone. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. My husband remained blind to the truth, too weary from work to notice the shadows stretching over our home. Outwardly, we looked like the perfect family. At church, neighbors praised my son for being polite, for carrying hymnals, for helping the elderly with their coats. No one knew that the same hands that offered help on Sunday were the hands that shackled me in fear behind closed doors. I began to change. My smile faded, my body weakened, my spirit dimmed. I stopped eating properly, and the mirror reflected a stranger. Sunken eyes, pale skin, a woman unraveling piece by piece. Friends asked if I was ill. I nodded and spoke of headaches, of fatigue. What words could I possibly use to tell the truth? How could I say that the boy they saw as a model young man had become my captor? It is difficult even now, all these years later, to admit aloud. There is a part of me that still feels the sting of shame, though I know with all my reason that the shame was never mine to carry. Still, survivors often bear the burden of guilt that does not belong to them. We question what we did wrong, what signs we ignored, whether somehow our silence made us complicit. Those questions are poison, and I drank them daily. Looking back, I see how the enemy thrives in secrecy. Silence is the fertile ground where abuse grows wild, choking every flower of joy. I told no one. Not my priest, not my closest friend, not even my own husband. I built a prison of secrecy around myself, and each day the walls grew higher. Yet God, in His mysterious way, never let me be fully consumed. Even in my darkest prayers, I sensed a flicker, like the tiniest flame that refuses to go out no matter how fierce the wind blows. That flicker carried me, even when I wanted to disappear, and now, after years of silence, I can finally speak. My name is Audrey Collins. I am a nun who has walked through fire and come out scarred but not destroyed. What you will hear from me is not easy, but it is real. This is the story of how I was betrayed by my own son, how I was silenced by fear, and how the truth finally broke free the day my husband opened the door and saw what I could no longer hide. When I think back to the early years, before the darkness took hold, I remember how much love I poured into my family. I was a mother who believed with all her heart that nurturing a child was the highest calling. My hands were always busy, preparing meals, mending clothes, guiding small fingers through schoolwork, smoothing fevered brows in the night. And in those ordinary gestures, I found a kind of sacred rhythm. I believed my home was my chapel, and my children were entrusted to me by God Himself. My son was my firstborn, the one who made me a mother. From the moment I held him, tiny and red-faced in the hospital bed, I felt a bond that seemed unbreakable. He was curious, bright-eyed, always reaching for me. I used to tell myself that perhaps he was closer to me than most children are to their mothers, because my husband worked such long hours. My husband would rise before dawn, return after dusk, his hands blistered and back bent from the factory. He carried his duty faithfully, but it left little space for tenderness. And so, all the tenderness of our household flowed between myself and the children. It was natural then, I thought, that my eldest would cling to me more than to anyone else. He would curl beside me with his school books, lean on my shoulder as I read him Bible verses, watch me with those searching eyes as though every answer in life could be found on my face. And I let him, because I believed it was love, because I believed this was what a mother was meant to give. But even before the storm truly broke, there were moments when the air grew uneasy around us. I remember the first time I noticed his gaze linger too long. No longer the innocent look of a child, but something heavier. I dismissed it instantly, ashamed of my own suspicion. "He is your son," I scolded myself. "Do not let wicked thoughts cloud the bond between you." A mother's heart does not want to imagine corruption where she longs to see only purity. As he grew older, his words began to change. Small comments, almost playful, that unsettled me, though I could not say why. "You are so beautiful, Mother," he would murmur, his voice deeper with adolescence, carrying a weight that made me stiffen. I smiled nervously, brushed it off as a boy learning how to speak in the world, convincing myself it was harmless. I told myself that my role was to guide him gently, to help him mature. I did not know then that those words were the faint rattling of chains that would soon bind me. My younger children noticed nothing. To them, I was simply Mama, the one who patched scraped knees, the one who sang them to sleep. To my husband, I was the steady keeper of the home, the one he thanked silently with weary eyes as he collapsed into bed after another long day of labor. To the neighbors, I was the devoted mother, the faithful wife, the quiet woman who never caused a stir. Only I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, though even then I tried to believe it was only in my imagination. I clung to prayer more tightly. In the quiet of evening, after the children were asleep, I would kneel beside my bed and whisper pleas into the darkness. Lord, make me a good mother, guard my children, protect this house. I thought my prayers were enough to shield us. But what I did not understand was that evil does not always storm the door with violence. Sometimes it enters gently, disguised as the very love you cherish most, and by the time you recognize it, it has already woven itself into your life. I recall one Sunday afternoon when my husband had gone to work an extra shift, and I was alone with the children. The younger ones played outside while I sewed in the kitchen. My eldest sat across the table, pretending to read but staring at me instead. When I looked up, he smiled, a smile that should have warmed me, but instead made a chill run down my spine. It was in that moment, fleeting but sharp, that I realized something was not right. The thought terrified me so deeply that I shoved it away, convincing myself I was tired, that my imagination was cruel. But the truth cannot be denied forever. The love I once carried like a crown began to weigh on me like chains. I began to sense that my devotion had become his possession. What had once been the pure bond of mother and son twisted slowly into something I could not name aloud. And in that silence, fear began its work. I wish I could tell you that I recognized the danger and acted quickly, that I found the courage to protect myself before the storm struck. But that is not my truth. My truth is that I continued to hope it was nothing, that I continued to excuse the unease, that I trusted my prayers would hold back what was already breaking through. Looking back, I see how gradually the prison was built. Brick by brick, moment by moment, I was being led into captivity without even realizing it. By the time I understood, it was too late to escape. And yet, within that memory, I also see something else. I see the depth of my humanity as a mother, the way I gave everything, the way I trusted, the way I loved, even when love was being twisted into something it was never meant to be. Perhaps that is why it hurt so deeply, because it was my son, the very one I believed I would give my life for, who instead began to take my life from me piece by piece. The chains were invisible then, but they grew heavier every day. And before long, those chains would tighten around me in ways that left scars I carry to this very day. I still remember the day the unthinkable first happened. It began like any other, wrapped in the ordinary rhythms of our home. That is how evil disguises itself most cruelly, by slipping into the ordinary, until the moment you realize the ordinary has become unsafe. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the air feels heavy and the curtains hang still in the windows. My husband was at work, the younger children outside in the yard. I was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes and humming softly, trying to ease the weight in my chest that had been growing for months. I had begun to live in small prayers whispered beneath my breath, clinging to them like lifelines. Lord, keep my children safe. Lord, keep me strong. I felt a presence behind me before I heard him. My son had a way of filling a room without speaking, his shadow falling over me like a storm cloud. When I turned, he was standing too close. His eyes were different, steady, intense, filled with something I did not yet dare to name. Mother, he said quietly, almost tenderly. You work too hard. It should have been a kind remark. But his tone carried a weight that made my skin crawl. I stepped aside, muttering that I was fine, that he should go help his siblings. But he did not move. His hand brushed against my arm, too deliberate, too lingering. I froze. For a moment, The world seemed to stop, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I whispered his name, my voice trembling. "Please, do not." But in his eyes I saw that something had shifted long before that day. He was no longer the boy who once clung to me in innocence. He had crossed into a darkness I could neither understand nor stop. What happened in those minutes left me broken in a way words can never fully carry. I will not describe the acts themselves, for they are not the story I need to tell. What matters is the weight of betrayal, the collapse of trust, the shattering of a bond meant to be sacred. It was as though the ground opened beneath me, and I fell into a pit with no bottom. When it was over, he looked at me with a strange mixture of fear and defiance. "No one will believe you," he whispered. "Not father, not anyone. You are my mother. Who would believe you against me?" And with those words, the chains closed around my soul. I stayed in the kitchen long after he left, trembling, my knees too weak to carry me. The water still ran in the sink, spilling over the edge, but I could not turn it off. I pressed my hands against the counter, trying to steady myself, whispering prayers that felt as fragile as paper. "God, help me. God, what do I do?" When the younger children came back inside, I forced a smile onto my face. I cooked supper, I laughed at their chatter, I tucked them into bed. To them, nothing seemed changed. But inside me, everything had been torn apart. That night, when my husband returned home weary from his long shift, I wanted so desperately to tell him, to fall into his arms and pour out the truth. But the words choked me. How could I speak them? How could I shatter the image of the son he admired, the boy he trusted? And deep down, fear consumed me. What if he did not believe me? What if he turned against me? So I said nothing. I sat across from him at the dinner table, nodding as he spoke about his work, my face pale under the lamplight. My son sat beside me, his head bowed in the posture of an obedient child. No one would have guessed that beneath that surface lay a secret so vile it could destroy us all. I hardly slept that night. I locked my door, though even the lock felt useless. I curled into the corner of my bed, clutching my rosary until my palms ached. Each bead was a lifeline, each whispered prayer a desperate cry. But heaven remained silent, or so it seemed. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, a moment that would never repeat. But as the days passed, I saw the way he watched me, the way he lingered, the way he carried himself with a strange new power. My heart pounded whenever I heard his footsteps. My body stiffened whenever he entered the room. The walls of my home, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. At church the following Sunday, I knelt in the pew and begged God for deliverance. The candles flickered, the choir sang hymns of mercy, but all I felt was a hollow ache. The very house of worship that should have been my refuge seemed far away from my suffering. I asked myself if perhaps this was punishment, if perhaps I had failed as a mother, as a wife, as a woman of faith. Shame coiled around me, whispering that the fault must be mine. But even then, even in that pit of despair, I sensed the faintest spark of defiance. I told myself I would endure for the sake of my younger children. I told myself I could carry this cross silently if it meant protecting them from scandal, from ruin. I thought I was being strong, but in truth, I was only binding myself more tightly in chains I could not yet see. That first violation was the door through which years of torment would march. Once the line had been crossed, there was no turning back. The boy I had raised, the son I once cradled, became the source of my deepest terror. And I, his mother, became a prisoner within my own skin. It is difficult now, even as I speak, to recall those early days without trembling. They were the beginning of a darkness that would stretch on far longer than I could ever have imagined. But they were also the beginning of something else, a slow awakening, a journey that would one day lead me to speak these words aloud. The road from silence to truth is long. And mine began in that kitchen on an ordinary afternoon, when a mother's love was twisted into chains. After that first violation, silence became my constant companion. It clung to me in every room, followed me through every day, pressed against me like a heavy shroud I could not remove. I wanted to believe it would stop, that what happened once would not happen again, but deep down, I knew the truth. A line had been crossed, and once crossed, it could never be uncrossed. The days that followed blurred together, but fear sharpened everything. Every sound in the hallway, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow became a warning bell in my mind. I began to live as if I were a hunted animal inside my own home. The walls no longer comforted me. The roof no longer sheltered me. Home became a prison, and I was its captive. I tried, in those early weeks, to tell myself that perhaps it was my imagination. But when my son came to me again, there was no denying it. He carried himself with a new boldness, as if he had discovered a secret power. He no longer feared my disapproval. He knew my silence, and he used it like a weapon. Each time he whispered that no one would believe me, the chains around my soul grew tighter. I thought of my husband constantly. He worked himself to exhaustion at the factory, unaware of what was happening under his roof. He would ask me at supper why I looked so pale, why I was not eating, why I seemed distracted. I forced a smile, stirred my food without appetite, and said I was only tired. How could I tell him? What words could a wife use to confess that her own son had betrayed her in such a way? Fear silenced me, but shame kept me captive. I began to wonder if I had somehow caused it, if my devotion had been misunderstood, if my tenderness as a mother had been twisted into something else. The questions devoured me. Did I encourage this without realizing it? Was my silence to blame? These lies echoed until I almost believed them. At church, I could barely lift my head. The hymns that once lifted my spirit now stung my ears. When neighbors complimented me on my good son, I felt the ground sway beneath me. They saw a polite young man who carried groceries for elderly widows and bowed respectfully to the priest. They did not see the shadow he cast over me at home, and so I played along, nodded politely, and kept the truth buried deeper. My body began to reflect the torment within. I lost weight. My hair thinned. The dark circles under my eyes deepened. My younger children asked why Mama looked sad all the time. I kissed their foreheads and told them I was only tired, always tired. And it was true. Tired of hiding. Tired of carrying a burden no one could see. Tired of pretending that life was normal when it was anything but. The silence changed me. I became smaller, quieter, withdrawn. Friends drifted away because I no longer had the energy to meet them for tea or to join them in church committees. They thought I was simply weary or unwell. They could never imagine the storm raging behind my closed doors. But the silence did not only protect me, it protected him. Each time I locked my lips, I gave him permission. He knew it. He reminded me. "Say nothing, or you will destroy the family," he would whisper. "Say nothing, or father will turn on you." Who will he believe, his wife or his son? His cruelty was sharpened with calculation, and I felt trapped in a maze with no exit. I prayed harder than I ever had before. Sometimes I spent hours on my knees whispering the same plea, "God, deliver me. God, protect me." But the heavens seemed closed, and the silence from above mirrored the silence within me. I began to wonder if I had been abandoned, if my suffering was invisible even to the Lord. My health worsened. There were nights I collapsed onto my bed trembling, drenched in cold sweat. My heart pounded as though it wanted to escape my chest. I woke often from nightmares, my mouth open in a scream I did not dare release. Sometimes I pressed my pillow against my face to muffle my sobs so the children would not hear. One evening, after another episode of fear, I shut myself in the bathroom and stared into the mirror. I hardly recognized the woman who looked back at me. Her eyes were hollow, her cheeks sunken, her lips cracked from dryness. "Who are you?" I whispered. The reflection did not answer. I felt as though I had already died and was only haunting my own life, and yet I still went on. I rose each morning, dressed the children, cooked meals, washed laundry, swept floors. To the world, I was the same mother and wife I had always been. That was the cruelest part, how easily life can look ordinary even while it is rotting from the inside. My son grew bolder as the months passed. He seemed to sense my fear, and he fed on it. Every time my husband left the house, I felt dread seep into my bones. I began to measure time not in hours, but in moments of danger and moments of reprieve. When my husband was home, I could breathe. When he was gone, I could not. There were moments I nearly told someone. Once, sitting with the parish priest during confession, the words rose to my lips, but I swallowed them back. How could I bring such shame into the light? Another time, when my closest friend asked gently if something was wrong, I nearly wept in her arms. But I laughed instead and said I was fine. Silence won again. In truth, silence had become its own kind of cage. I thought I was protecting my family, shielding my husband from heartbreak, sparing my children from scandal. But what I was really doing was protecting the one who harmed me. And with every day that passed, the cage grew stronger. Looking back now, I see how silence is not neutral. Silence sides with the oppressor. Silence keeps the victim locked in darkness. Silence allows evil to grow unchecked. I know this now, but at the time, I believed silence was my only choice. Those days stretched into months, each one heavier than the last. I wondered if my life would always be this way, if my voice would ever return. And though I did not know it then, the silence was leading me to a breaking point. A point where truth could no longer be chained. If anyone had looked at our family from the outside, they would have seen nothing but a picture of harmony. We were the sort of household neighbors pointed to with admiration, the kind spoken of in passing as an example of stability. My husband, though weary from his labor, carried himself with quiet pride. My younger children, with their bright eyes and laughter, filled the air with joy. And my eldest son, the one who had already shattered my soul, played his role so convincingly that no one suspected the truth. At church, he wore his best clothes, greeted elders with respect, and held hymnals for the frail. Parishioners often told me how blessed I was to have such a fine son. Their words struck me like daggers, though I smiled in return. To them he was the model of obedience. To me, he was a shadow that followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of chains no one else could see. The deception spread into every corner of our life. At the dinner table, my son laughed with his siblings, recited stories from school, even complimented me in front of his father. My husband would nod approvingly, unaware of the cruelty hidden beneath that charm. And I sat quietly, forcing food past lips that had no appetite, my stomach twisting with every word. The very table meant for nourishment became a stage where I performed my silence night after night. It is a terrible thing to live two lives at once, the life you show the world, and the life you endure in secret. I became an actress in my own home, rehearsing smiles, practicing calm tones, hiding the tremor in my hands. When friends invited me to gatherings, I politely declined, claiming exhaustion. I could not bear the thought of sitting among them while my heart carried such a poisonous secret. The mask I wore was suffocating, but it was the only thing holding the pieces of my world together. My health worsened under the strain. I fainted once while hanging laundry in the yard. My younger daughter screamed for help, and the neighbors rushed over, fanning my face until I stirred. They insisted I must see a doctor, but I waved them off, claiming it was only the heat. Inside, I knew the truth. It was not heat that felled me, but the crushing weight of fear. Even my prayers became masked. In public, I prayed as expected, bowing my head, folding my hands. But in the solitude of night, my prayers poured out like blood from a wound. "God, why?" I whispered. "Why must I live this lie? Why do you not deliver me?" The silence that followed felt unbearable. At times I wondered if my sins, whatever they were, had led me to this punishment. Guilt whispered lies, and I swallowed them whole. My son, meanwhile, grew more skilled at his performance. He brought home good marks from school, spoke respectfully to teachers, and never raised his voice in public. People praised him as a shining example of youth. My husband beamed with pride, his chest swelling at the compliments. To me, every word of praise was another stone laid upon my chest, another reminder of how invisible my suffering was. I remember one particular evening vividly. We had guests, family friends who came for supper. The table was set, candles flickered, and laughter filled the room. My husband told stories of his younger days, the children giggled, and my son served food with the manners of a gentleman. No one could have imagined that beneath the polished surface I sat trembling, counting the minutes until the evening ended. I forced smiles, nodded in agreement, even laughed when expected. But my hands shook so badly that I nearly dropped a plate. One of the guests reached over and said kindly, "You must be tired, Audrey. You always do so much for this family." I smiled again, swallowing tears, and whispered, "Yes, only tired." The mask held, but inside I felt myself unraveling. Each day I became less of who I once was. I avoided mirrors, unable to face the hollow eyes staring back. I withdrew from friends, from family, from life itself. I existed only to keep the illusion intact, to maintain the facade that we were a family untouched by darkness. Yet even as I suffocated under the mask, I knew cracks were forming. My husband began to notice more often that I hardly ate. He asked why I seemed so withdrawn, why I avoided his touch, why I stared off in silence so often. I answered with vague excuses, headaches, fatigue, the endless duties of motherhood. But I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. He did not yet know the truth, but he sensed that something was wrong, and my son knew it too. He could feel his father's suspicion growing, and that made him restless, harsher in his whispered threats. "Remember," he warned me one night when no one else could hear, "you say one word and everything falls apart. They will hate you. They will blame you. Keep silent." His words pressed deeper than knives, and fear sealed my lips once more. Still, I began to realize that the facade could not last forever. No mask can remain unbroken when worn too long. My body was failing, my spirit nearly extinguished, and even those around me were beginning to see glimpses of the truth. I did not yet know how or when, but something was going to break, and when it did, the perfect picture of our family would shatter into pieces no one could ignore. The mask I wore could only hold for so long before the cracks began to show. My body, already weakened by sleepless nights and endless fear, started to betray me. The fainting spells became more frequent. Headaches split through my skull like storms. Some mornings I struggled to rise from bed, my limbs trembling as though I were carrying stones tied to every bone. Still, I forced myself up, forced myself to cook, to clean, to smile for the children. But inside, I was collapsing. My husband asked more questions now, his eyes narrowing with concern. "Audrey, you look thinner every day. What is happening to you?" He would press. I gave the same answers again and again. Headaches, tiredness, the strain of managing the home. He wanted to believe me, I think, but doubt had already taken root. He saw me wither while my son seemed to thrive, and though he did not yet understand why, he could sense the imbalance. Nights became unbearable. I would curl into myself in the corner of my bed, clutching my rosary until the beads left marks in my palms. My prayers grew desperate, almost frantic. "God, I cannot do this anymore. Give me strength or take me away. Do not leave me like this." But the heavens were silent. That silence cut me more deeply than words ever could. It felt as though even God had turned his face away. I remember one night in particular. The house was still, the children asleep, the lamps extinguished. I sat at the table with a single candle burning, staring at its flame. My body ached from exhaustion, but my mind would not rest. Memories of my son's threats echoed in my skull. "No one will believe you. Keep silent, or everything will fall apart." I whispered to the candle. Maybe it would be better if I were gone. The thought terrified me, but it lingered, like a shadow whispering in my ear. The next morning, I collapsed in the kitchen. My younger daughter found me on the floor, clutching at the table leg, gasping for breath. She screamed, and my husband came running. He lifted me with trembling arms, his face pale with fear. "Audrey, what is happening to you?" he demanded. I wanted so badly to tell him the truth then, but when I opened my mouth, the words dissolved. Instead, I whispered, "I am just so tired." He carried me to bed, sat beside me, and stroked my hair like I was a child. His eyes shone with helplessness, and it broke me to see his pain while knowing the truth still remained hidden. I began to wonder if perhaps I was truly losing my mind. Fear, shame, exhaustion, they blurred together until I could not tell one from the other. I would sit in church on Sunday, staring at the crucifix, and wonder if anyone around me could see the torment inside me. They saw a weary mother, a devoted wife, a woman carrying burdens like so many others. They could not see the storm that was tearing me apart. My son grew more impatient as my health faltered. He seemed to fear that my weakness might draw suspicion, and his whispers became sharper, more venomous. "Do not ruin this family," he hissed one evening when we crossed paths in the hallway. His eyes glowed with a coldness that made me shudder. "Keep your mouth shut, or you will regret it." Every threat tightened the chains until I felt I could scarcely breathe. The children noticed more than I realized. My youngest asked me one night, "Mama, why do you cry in your sleep?" Her innocent question pierced me deeper than any blade could. I held her close, kissed her hair, and told her it was only dreams. But I knew the truth. My silence was not only destroying me, it was poisoning my children's world as well. It was around this time that I began to feel as though I were disappearing. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger's face, hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, lips pressed in a line of sorrow. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, thin and weak. I spoke less, smiled less, lived less. I moved through my days like a ghost, haunting my own home, and yet even in that state, a tiny flicker of will remained. I told myself that if God had not ended my life, then perhaps He still had purpose for me. That thought kept me from slipping fully into despair. It was faint, fragile, but it was there, a whisper that said, "Hold on. Something will change." I did not know then how soon that change would come, nor how devastating it would be. All I knew was that I could not continue as I was. My body was breaking, my soul was breaking, and silence was no longer enough to protect anyone. Something had to give, and when it did, it would shatter the facade of our family forever. The day the truth broke open began like any other. My husband left for work at dawn, the younger children hurried off to school, and I carried on with my routine, though by then, routine meant little more than survival. My body still ached from exhaustion, and my spirit was drained. I moved slowly, folding laundry, scrubbing dishes, whispering prayers under my breath. I thought the day would pass in the same heavy silence as all the others. But that afternoon something shifted. My husband returned earlier than usual. The factory had dismissed workers halfway through the shift because of a broken machine. I did not know this at the time. I only knew that I was not expecting him, and neither was my son. I was in the bedroom, gathering clothes to mend, when I heard the door creak open. At first I thought nothing of it. My son often lingered near me, his presence heavy like a storm cloud. But there was a sharpness in his tone that froze my blood. He spoke words I will not repeat, words that dripped with entitlement and threat. Before I could respond, the door swung wider. And there in the frame stood my husband. His face, usually calm and weary from long hours, twisted with horror. His eyes darted from me to our son, and in that instant he understood. For a heartbeat, silence filled the room, so complete that even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Then came the sound I will never forget, my husband's roar. It was not the voice of the gentle man I had married, nor the weary laborer who returned home each night. It was the cry of a father betrayed, of a man who had stumbled upon a nightmare inside his own home. He lunged at our son, his hands shaking with rage. My son tried to defend himself, stammering excuses, but his words dissolved beneath the weight of my husband's fury. "How dare you!" my husband shouted, his voice echoing through the walls. "This is your mother! This is my wife!" I stood frozen, my knees weak, my breath trapped in my throat. The scene unfolded like a storm I had long feared and long prayed for. At last, someone else knew. At last, the silence was broken. And yet, the chaos terrified me. My son's face twisted with defiance. "She wanted it," he spat, his voice sharp as glass. The words cut me open, though I knew they were lies. My husband struck the table with his fist, the sound like thunder. "Do not dare speak such filth," he bellowed. "You have disgraced this family, disgraced me, disgraced everything sacred under this roof." The house became a battlefield. My younger children, hearing the commotion, rushed to the hallway, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. I screamed for them to go back, to stay away, but they hovered at the edges, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. In that chaos, I felt torn in two. Part of me wanted to collapse into my husband's arms, to finally unburden the truth. But another part of me feared the violence, the unraveling of our family before the eyes of our children. I whispered, "Please, stop, not in front of them." But the tide could not be turned back. My husband forced our son toward the door, his face a mask of fury and grief. My son resisted, shouting denials, twisting the truth with every word. "She is lying. She is weak. But my husband silenced him with a voice like fire. "No more lies. I saw enough. You will not harm her again." In that moment I saw something break in my son's eyes. The mask he had worn for years, the charm he displayed before the world, shattered. What was left was raw, ugly, unrepentant. He glared at me, his jaw clenched, as though I had betrayed him by not keeping silent. And then he was gone, driven from the room by his father's wrath. When the door slammed shut, the house shook with silence again. My younger children clung to each other, their faces pale with confusion. My husband turned to me, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with both fury and sorrow. "How long?" he whispered. "How long has this been happening?" The words I had held back for years spilled at last. My voice trembled as I confessed the truth, though even then I could not bring myself to say everything plainly. I told him I had been afraid, that I had been silenced, that shame had sealed my lips. Tears poured down my face, and my body shook with the release of a burden too heavy to bear. My husband's face crumpled. He pulled me into his arms, holding me as though I were breaking into pieces before him. "Why did you not tell me?" he cried. I had no answer, only sobs. Because fear had stolen my words. Because shame had stolen my voice. Because silence had become my prison. That night, the house did not sleep. My husband paced the floor, wrestling with his rage. My younger children whispered questions I could not answer. I sat in the corner, drained, hollow, yet strangely lighter. The secret was no longer mine alone. The chains had cracked, though I still felt their weight. The confrontation had torn open wounds that could never be hidden again. Our family, once admired from the outside, was shattered within. Nothing would ever be the same. And though the truth had been revealed, I knew the road ahead would not be easier. In some ways, it had only begun. After the night my husband discovered the truth, our house was never the same again. The walls that once held the sound of laughter now carried whispers, arguments, and heavy silences that clung like smoke. What had been hidden for years now lay exposed, and though the burden of secrecy had been lifted from me, the cost was devastating. My husband could not contain his fury. He stormed through the house in restless anger, slamming doors, muttering curses under his breath, pacing the floors at all hours. He looked at our son not with pride anymore, but with eyes that burned like fire. The betrayal had pierced him too deeply. He had worked himself to the bone to provide for this family, believing he had built something safe and strong. Now he felt it had been poisoned from within, and he did not know how to live with it. My younger children, confused and frightened, clung to me constantly. They asked questions I could not answer. Why was Father shouting? Why did Brother leave the house that night? Why is everything different now? Their innocence was being stolen by shadows they could not yet name, and it broke my heart to see their trust begin to falter. I wanted to shield them, to cover their ears, to tell them everything would be fine. But I could not promise what I did not believe myself. Our son, stripped of his mask, lashed out with venom. He denied everything, twisted the story, tried to paint me as weak, unstable, even deceitful. "She is lying," he spat in front of my husband one evening. "She has always been sick in the head." His words were knives, and though my husband struck the table in rage, shouting him down, a part of me still flinched. What if others believed him? What if the world saw me not as a victim, but as a monster who accused her own child? Neighbors began to whisper. Word spread quickly, though not all of it was true. Some noticed the tension in our home, the way my husband's face grew darker with each passing day, the way I seemed frailer than ever. Questions floated in hushed voices, glances lingered too long, sympathy mixed with suspicion. I felt eyes on me everywhere I went. At the market, at church, even walking down the street, I felt the weight of unseen judgment pressing down. The priest came to our home once, after hearing rumors. He sat in our parlor, his hands folded tightly, his eyes full of unspoken questions. I wanted to open my mouth to lay the truth bare, but the shame still held me back. I spoke only in vague words, enough for him to sense the gravity of the situation, but not enough to force him to act. He left with a prayer on his lips and worry in his eyes. I felt both relieved and guilty. My husband grew restless with rage. "He cannot stay here," he declared one evening, his fists clenched. "He has destroyed this family. He has destroyed you. He must be gone." But the thought of casting my own son out into the world filled me with dread. He was my child, no matter what he had done. Part of me still longed to protect him, though I knew I should have been protecting myself. The conflict tore me apart inside, motherly instinct battling with the truth of the damage he had caused. The younger children cried at night, asking why their brother no longer laughed with them, why father looked at him with hate, why I seemed so broken. I held them close, whispered soothing words I did not believe, and kissed their hair until they drifted into restless sleep. Their questions echoed in my heart long after the house grew quiet. Arguments between my husband and me grew more frequent. He wanted to act decisively, to throw our son out, to tell the world what he had done. I hesitated, still tangled in fear and shame. "If people know," I whispered, "they will despise us. They will despise me." He looked at me then with eyes full of sorrow. "Audrey, they will despise him. You have carried this alone for too long." But still, I could not bring myself to take the final step. Our son's presence became unbearable. He walked through the house with defiance, sneering at me, muttering under his breath when my husband was not near. "You ruined everything," he hissed. "You opened your mouth, and now look what you have done." His hatred seeped into every corner of the home, poisoning the air until even breathing felt like a struggle. The night came when my husband finally confronted him fully. Words turned into shouts, shouts turned into violence, and I stood trembling as father and son clashed in the center of our living room. My younger children cried in the doorway, their faces pale with fear. "Enough!" I screamed, my voice raw. "This cannot go on. In that moment, I realized that the family we once were was gone, shattered beyond repair. The secret had broken us, and there would be no mending. That night, as I sat in the quiet aftermath, the house heavy with sorrow, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. The truth was no longer hidden. The facade had crumbled. But what lay ahead was uncertain, frightening, and irreversible. I knew we had crossed a threshold from which we could never return. Our family, once admired, once envied, was in ruins. The son I had loved became the cause of our downfall. My husband, once my shield, was now consumed with anger he did not know how to carry. And I was left standing amid the wreckage, wondering if I had the strength to endure what came next. In the days that followed the confrontation, the air in our home grew unbearable. My husband's rage simmered in every silence. My younger children walked on tiptoe as though the floor itself might break beneath them, and my son's defiance hardened like stone. The house that once held our family together now felt like a battlefield where every glance, every word carried the threat of another eruption. It became clear to my husband that something had to be done. "He cannot stay here," he said one night, his voice low but steady. His hands trembled as he spoke, and I could see the weight of his decision pressing on him. "Audrey, if he remains, he will destroy you. He will destroy us all." I wept at those words, torn between the truth and the ache of a mother's heart. No matter what he had done, he was still my son. I had carried him within me, prayed over him, loved him with every breath of my being. To see him cast out was agony, yet to keep him near was a death sentence for my soul. I knew what needed to happen, though accepting it felt like tearing myself in two. The night my husband forced him to leave, the world seemed to still. My son shouted, cursed, spat venomous words meant to wound me. "You will regret this," he sneered as he gathered his things. His eyes burned with hatred, and for a moment I saw nothing of the child I once cradled. He slammed the door, and with that sound, years of silence and fear seemed to shatter all at once. The house was quiet afterward, painfully quiet. My younger children clung to me, their faces pale with confusion. "Where is he going, Mama?" they asked. I could not answer fully. I could only whisper, "He cannot be here anymore. It is for the best." They did not understand, but they felt my trembling arms around them, and for that moment it was enough. Though my son was gone from the house, the scars remained. I found myself wandering through the rooms as if expecting him to appear, my body tightening at every sound. Nightmares plagued me, dragging me back to the years of silence. But now, for the first time, I was not alone in the truth. My husband knew. The secret was no longer mine to bear alone. He tried to be strong for me, though I could see his own torment eating at him. Some nights I found him sitting at the table long after midnight, his face buried in his hands. He felt guilt for not seeing sooner, rage for what had been done, and helplessness in the face of wounds he could not heal. Yet despite his pain, he became my protector. He no longer allowed me to be alone in the house when he could help it, and when fear overwhelmed me, he held me close and whispered, "You are safe now. He will not touch you again." For the first time in years, I began to feel the faint stirrings of safety. Fragile, yes, but real. Help began to come from unexpected places. A trusted friend, sensing the weight I carried, offered me comfort without demanding details. She prayed with me, sat with me in silence, and reminded me that God had not abandoned me, even if I could not yet feel his presence. A priest, who had long suspected something, gently urged me to seek healing, reminding me that my suffering did not define my worth. Their words did not erase the pain, but they lit small candles in the darkness, and I clung to them. Slowly, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps life could be more than survival. That perhaps I could still heal, even if the scars never faded. I began to take small steps, writing in a journal, pouring out memories I could not yet speak aloud, praying with raw honesty instead of rehearsed words. Sometimes my prayers were only tears, but I believe God counted them all the same. My younger children became my anchor. Their laughter, though subdued at first, began to return, and I found myself smiling through tears when I heard them play. They reminded me that innocence still existed in the world, that not everything was broken. Holding them close gave me strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The road was not easy. Fear still gripped me at night, shame still whispered in my ear, and grief for the son I had lost, though he still lived, pressed heavily on my heart. But I also knew this. I was no longer alone, and I was no longer silent. The cage I had lived in for years had been broken open, and though stepping into the light was terrifying, it was also the only way toward freedom. Looking back now, I see that this was the true beginning of my rescue. Not a sudden miracle, not an instant healing, but the slow, painful steps of a woman learning to breathe again after years of suffocation. It was the beginning of a journey that would eventually lead me here, to this life of faith and testimony. My son's absence created a wound in our family that would never fully close. But his absence also gave me space to begin to heal, to reclaim the pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. The silence was over. The chains were broken. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I finally believed there could be life after despair. When I look back now, it feels as though my life has been divided into two halves, the years of silence and the years of truth. For so long, I lived hidden behind walls of shame and fear, convinced that my story was too ugly to be spoken, too broken to be redeemed. But God, in His mercy, had a different plan. He did not erase my scars. He transformed them into testimony. After my son was gone from our home, healing did not come quickly. It came in fragile steps, like learning to walk again after a devastating fall. There were mornings I woke in tears, the weight of grief pressing down until I could hardly rise from bed. There were nights when nightmares dragged me back into the past, my body trembling as if the chains still bound me. But slowly, through prayer, through the support of those who truly loved me, I began to stand again. My husband, though burdened by his own anger and sorrow, became my shield. His hands, once calloused from years of factory labor, now held me with gentleness, as though I might break if he let go. He could not undo what had been done, but he vowed to walk beside me through the valley of healing. In time, the fury in his eyes softened into sorrow, and the sorrow into determination. Together, we began to build again, though what we built was different from what we had before. It was not easy to face the community. Whispers lingered, suspicion spread, and I carried the weight of people's stares. Some judged, some pitied, some turned away altogether. At first, I shrank from them, ashamed of what they might think of me. But then I realized something. I had survived what should have destroyed me. I had endured the unendurable. Why should I hide? Why should I carry shame that was never mine to bear? That realization marked a turning point. I began to speak, not to everyone, not all at once, but to those who needed to hear. I spoke to women who sat across from me in quiet corners, tears in their eyes as they whispered of their own hidden wounds. I spoke to priests and counselors who wanted to understand how to help others in silence. And in time, I spoke to larger groups, my voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word. Each time I spoke, I felt a little freer. My journey eventually led me to a convent. I had always carried faith in my heart, even when I felt abandoned. Now I wanted to devote what remained of my life to God's service, not out of despair, but out of gratitude that He had carried me through. The sisters welcomed me with kindness, never asking me to bury my past, but encouraging me to offer it as a source of compassion for others. Within those walls, I found not only healing but also purpose. In the stillness of prayer, I began to see my scars differently. They were no longer marks of shame. They were marks of survival, reminders that darkness had not destroyed me. My silence had once been my prison, but now my voice became my freedom. By sharing what I had endured, I discovered I could help others break their own chains. To this day, I remain a woman who carries scars. They do not vanish. They do not cease to ache from time to time, but they no longer define me. What defines me now is faith, resilience, and the calling to stand beside others who walk through the same shadows I once knew. Sometimes I still think of my son. I wonder where he went, what kind of man he became, if he ever faced the weight of what he had done. There is sorrow in those thoughts, but also release. I no longer carry his sin as my own. I place him in God's hands for judgment and for mercy. That is no longer my burden. And so here I stand, years later, as Sister Audrey Collins, a nun who has walked through fire and come out alive. My story is not one I ever imagined telling, but I tell it because I know there are others still trapped in silence. To them I say, you are not alone. Your voice matters. Your scars can become light for someone else still lost in the dark. I share this not to relive the pain, but to bear witness to the truth, that even the deepest wounds can become wells of grace. That even in the darkest nights, a flicker of faith can survive. And that no matter how long silence has bound you, there is always a path toward freedom. My scars remain, yes, but they no longer chain me. They shine as reminders that I endured, that I rose, that I live not as a victim, but as a testimony of God's unbreakable love.